Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Professor Sarah Skerret, Director of Programmes at the Royal Society of Edinburgh, or RSE. The core mission of the RSE is knowledge made useful. We're an educational charity established in 1783. We are wholly independent and non-party political, and we provide public benefit throughout Scotland. Throughout our history, we've drawn upon the expertise of our 1,600 plus fellows who are based in Scotland, the rest of the UK and worldwide. Our fellowship covers the full range of disciplines: science and technology, arts, humanities, social science, and also includes business and public service. Today, we're really delighted as the RSE to welcome you and deliver our 7th joint annual event with the Royal Institute of Philosophy, a charity dedicated to the advancement of philosophy in all its branches through the organisation and promotion of teaching, discussion, and research of all things philosophical. The Institute is not committed to any particular philosophical school, method, or ideology. Each year, the Institute sponsors hundreds of free open philosophy events, bringing critical thinking to thousands of people. And with that introduction, it's now my absolute pleasure to introduce the chair of today's event, Dr. Julian Baggini, Academic Director of the Royal Institute of Philosophy. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, and welcome. I don't want to spend too much time saying much else because we've got a lot to get through in this session on the misunderstood risks of climate change. The talk is going to be given today by Dale Jamieson, Professor of Environmental Studies and Philosophy at New York University. He actually has plenty of other titles as well, more than the Queen, but all of them as a result of his efforts rather than accidents of birth, I should point out. He's the author of many books: Reason in a Dark Time, Why the Struggle to Stop Climate Change Failed and What It Means for Our Future, Morality's Progress, most recently, Discerning Experts, the Practicalities of Scientific Assessment for Environmental Policy. In 2016, he was actually awarded the Association of Environmental Studies and Sciences William R. Freudenberg Lifetime Achievement Award. So we couldn't have got someone more well qualified to give this lecture for us. I'm personally delighted to have Dale here. In the 3rd edition of the Philosopher's Magazine, we interviewed him while he was in London for a conference on environmental ethics. There's the rather amateurish looking cover, I'm afraid. What was interesting there was it was a great conference, very interesting conference. The kind of issues Dale and his colleagues were talking about were at the time, I think, still considered rather marginal, not taken seriously by everyone. So much has changed since then. Now everyone recognises these issues are important, and yet still it seems there's such a long way to go, that a lot of the key things are not resulting in action. So where are we? Well, Dale is bringing the debate really sort of forward in this talk because he's going to talk to us about not just the risks of climate change that are well understood, but those which are perhaps less understood and misunderstood. He'll talk for about half an hour, and then we'll have a response, which I'll introduce nearer the time. But let's kick off with Dale's talk.
I would like to begin by thanking the Royal Society of Edinburgh and the Royal Institute of Philosophy for inviting me to give this talk. It's an honor to address both of you, and I only regret that I'm addressing you using this medium from so many miles away, but thank you again. So in this talk, I discuss some of the misunderstood risks of climate change. Now, I want to be clear at the outset about what I mean by misunderstood. It's not as though I've found some secret compartment somewhere where some risks are identified that no one has ever seen before. We can know relevant truths about an issue and still misunderstand it. Misunderstanding typically involves ignorance or false beliefs, but it can also involve failing to appreciate the salience, significance, and importance of what is known. Information-rich environments can make it more difficult to grasp the significance of what we know by obscuring what matters most in a sea of trivia. and a misinformation-rich environment can make it difficult to know what to believe in the first place. Furthermore, because of our deeply human ability to compartmentalize, we can comfortably exist in logically distinct, even contradictory worlds without feeling much pressure to bring them together. So, for example, I may vote for my Republican congressman who looks, talks, and acts like a responsible congressman, while at the same time decrying the climate change denying policies of the Republican majority of which he is a part. So what I want to suggest in this talk today is that the significance of some of the most important risks of climate change, those that may have the greatest impacts on our lives, are misunderstood in the ways that I have briefly described. It's not that we're unaware of them, but rather that their significance is obscured by rhetoric, uncertainty, misinformation, denial, and various features and bugs of our cognitive systems. And as a result, these risks are often ablated in our thought and action. So I want to begin by just giving you a little background about climate change. For some of you, this will be completely redundant, but others may be relatively new to the subject. So what is colorlessly called the problem of climate change is fundamentally driven by the anthropogenic disruption of the planetary carbon cycle. The disruption of the methane, nitrogen, and hydrological cycles are also implicated, as is the emission of non-naturally occurring fluorinated gases. These disruptions contribute to the frequency of extreme meteorological events, such as more intense hurricanes and droughts, as well as sea level rise and other phenomena. These consequences affect both individual people and institutions, such as firms and governments, which themselves stand in feedback relations to each other in ways that affect both their contributions and responses to the disruptions that initiated the cascade. In short, we are enmeshed in complex global systems in which humans, institutions, and natural systems are linked in weakly understood ways that involve powerful feedback loops. From the point of view of human decision-making, this implies reflexivity. We respond to the occurrence of extreme events, and their intensity and likelihood are affected by our responses. So, for example, we emit climate destabilizing gases, thus it becomes hotter, and so we install more air conditioning, thus emitting more climate destabilizing gases, and on it goes. Now, anthropogenic climate change has been discussed more or less as a fact since the work of Arrhenius in the early 20th century, but it was only in the last half of the century that it was clearly seen as negative. The foreword to a 1979 report published by the United States National Academy of Sciences warned that a wait-and-see policy may mean waiting until it's too late. In the United States, at least, however, climate change was initially seen as a technical rather than moral or political issue. Economic perspectives dominated the policy discussion, and concern was addressed about responding too quickly or too aggressively. The optimal path was to reap the benefits of emitting carbon as long as possible while pushing reductions into the future when they would be cheaper to achieve and the potential damages would be greater. But policy does not respond directly to the curves drawn by economists, and the emitting has continued far beyond what most economists would consider to be rational. Now, there are many reasons for this, but by 1989 in the United States, the fossil fuel industry was already organized against climate action, while the first highly visible climate-specific environmental advocacy group, 350.org, was formed only in 2007. In 2008, Obama was elected president on a platform that included climate action. But his first year in office saw the failure of both the climate legislation that he had proposed and the Copenhagen Climate Conference. He responded by taking executive action to reduce emissions, but this proved vulnerable to court challenges and to a change of administration. Obama's presidency was capped by the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement, which was signed to great acclaim. But this was really only a modest revision of the 1992 United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and did not include binding commitments or sanctions. The United States is now withdrawn from the Paris Agreement, but will almost certainly rejoin early next year. 2018 marked a turning point in the global politics of climate change with Greta Thunberg's school strike and the rise of such activist groups as Extinction Rebellion. In her 2019 address to world leaders at the UN Climate Action Summit, Thunberg said, "This is all wrong. I shouldn't be up here. I should be back in school on the other side of the ocean. Yet you all come to us, young people, for hope. How dare you? You have stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words. You are failing us." But the young people are starting to understand your betrayal. The eyes of all future generations are upon you. And if you choose to fail us, I say, we will never forgive you. Now, this story that I have been telling is one in which climate change begins as a scientific issue with a technical solution, and increasingly becomes a public issue with no conventional political solution, giving rise to activism and increasingly apocalyptic language. Now, apocalyptic thinking around climate change has been a persistent but submerged theme in the discourse. Scientific reports from the 1980s focused on famine, floods, and droughts, although they tended to avoid such direct language. And with recent fires in Australia and in North America, hurricanes in the Caribbean, and pandemic everywhere, the biblical risks of climate change have been brought to the surface. Fire, flood, famine, drought, wind, and pestilence are archetypal fears that figure in the mythologies and sacred texts of most cultures. People have responded to them by submission to God, casting out demons, or embracing a cycle of destruction and rebirth. The Paris Climate Agreement and the Green New Deal are pale substitutes for this. But beyond the biblical risks of climate change are what I call the existential risks, eloquently articulated in recent books and articles such as The Uninhabitable Earth, Learning to Die in the Anthropocene, We're Doomed, Now What? And What If We Stopped Pretending? Now, the expert community has been largely dismissive of such texts. To some extent, this is because they are authored by professional writers, journalists, and humanities professors, rather than climate scientists or policy analysts. The substantive criticism is that these authors exaggerate the risks of climate change, plunging people into despair and apathy, rather than motivating them to act. Yes, we should not exceed 2 degrees centigrade warming, but better 3 degrees than 4 degrees, and better 4 degrees than 5 degrees. Climate catastrophe comes in degrees. Apocalypse does not. However, the risk with which these authors are primarily concerned is not the extinction of the species Homo sapiens, but rather the extinction of our cultures, civilizations, and ways of life. That is why an appeal to one of the most salient features of Homo sapiens, its ability to adapt, does not extinguish the concern. 3 years after the Allies entered the smoking ruins of Berlin, the German economic miracle was underway. 15 years after, Roberto Rossellini depicted the daily struggle for food and shelter in his amazingly wonderful movie, Roma Città Aperta, Rome, Open City. 15 years later, another wonderful Italian director, Federico Fellini, was portraying the jadedness of Roman life in La Dolce Vita. In some way, these stories may provide reason for hope, but they do not compensate for the losses. Imagine someone comforting an inhabitant of Warsaw in 1939 by telling her that the horror that was being unleashed on her city would eventually be reversed. Within a few years, happy people would once again be in the streets, although she personally would not be able to recognize much of her city or understand its way of life. While this might give her some consolation, it would not compensate for the horror that was befalling her. For beyond the suffering and death, there is the question of meaning. What we want is not just biological continuity, but the persistence of our values, cultures, and ways of life. What makes climate change an existential risk is the way that it remakes the world, ruptures our time horizons, erodes our commitments to long-term projects, and damages our hopes for our children and their futures. Climate change is an existential threat, not to the existence of our species, but to virtually everything else that we care about. As for apathy and despair, these authors implore us to mitigate the damages as far as possible. But their primary aim is to shock us with the severity of the crisis. And indeed, that was my intention in my book, Reason in a Dark Time, published in 2004. They want us to understand that we are already being engulfed by profound change. And the radical challenge that we face is how to live through this time of transformation. Survival in any form depends on accepting the depth of the crisis and the profundity of the loss. As writers, rather than scientists or policy analysts, they are primarily addressing people who may experience climate panic, but are unmoved by indifference curves or figures reflecting the Earth's carbon budget. Now, the existential risk of climate change engages one of the most primeval fears of humanity, the fear of chaos and disorder. Climate change threatens chaos, and this fear quickly turns political. Together with the Italian political theorist Marcello Di Paola, I have argued that climate change and other problems of the Anthropocene pose risks that even the most perfect democracies may not be able to manage. The traditional vulnerabilities of democracy identified by Plato and Hobbes, lack of governance expertise, voter ignorance, and instability, are magnified by the interlocking crises that climate change both expresses and generates. Climate change can only be managed through global cooperation, yet democracies are responsible only to their voters. And this can give rise to weak multilateralism and even glaring indifference to those beyond their political and temporal boundaries. Managing climate change requires a long-term perspective, yet the time horizon of democratic decision makers is keyed to the electoral cycle. There are a large number of veto players in some representative democracies that can prevent popular policies from being enacted. For example, in the United States, the president, each House of Congress, and the Supreme Court are veto players. So are civil society actors such as political parties, unions, and organized economic interests. In 2016, 80,000 voters in 3 key states vetoed the presidential candidate who won the national popular vote. And indeed, in the election that we have just concluded, it may well be that had 80,000 voters voted for the Republican candidate rather than the Democratic candidate, they would have vetoed the person who won the popular vote, this time by 5 million votes rather than 3 million votes. Another tension endemic to democracy, that between equality and expertise, takes on special significance with climate change in a democracy. In a democracy, expertise is always subservient to the voice of the people. A democratic citizen can say to the expert, "You may be right, but who made you the boss of what I should do?" But a democratic citizen can go further and ask, "You may be an expert, but who made you the boss of what I should believe?" Denialism about expertise appears to be on the rise, and even spilling over into conspiratorial confabulation. Recent surveys have indicated that 44% of US Republicans believe that Bill Gates is planning to use a mass COVID-19 vaccine campaign to microchip billions of people so that their movements can be tracked. And a recent study in Australia suggests that 1/5 of young Australians believe that Bill Gates actually played a role in the creation and propagation of COVID-19. Now, what is new about denialism in the Anthropocene is not its strategy or tactics, but the technologies used to amplify it. Through social media, denialism now directly connects hundreds of millions of people, bypassing traditional intermediaries such as experts, political parties, and professional journalists. Indeed, in an effort to maintain their relevance, these traditional intermediaries often seem to replicate the immediacy and excitement of social media in their own communications. If you want to be an influential professor these days, you often are graded by the number of social media followers that you may have. And as a result, epistemological authority that comes from studied expertise, analytical thinking, systematic empirical investigation, and practices such as peer review and multiple sourcing is increasingly subordinated to branding and marketing. In addition to climate change, policy failures with respect to COVID-19 and the management of the global economy are also feeding denialism. Much of the world had not recovered from the financial crisis of 2008 when the economic shutdown of 2020 occurred, stimulated by the COVID-19 pandemic, which is not yet under control. Since climate change contributes to the occurrence of pandemics, the worst may be yet to come. Mismanagement of these crises puts at risk the political legitimacy of democratic states. Two traditional sources of legitimacy are the provision of beneficial consequences, the utilitarian tradition, and the consent of the governed, the social contract tradition. The failure of governments to successfully address problems of climate change, public health, and economic security diminishes beneficial consequences as a ground for their political legitimacy. The fact that national governments have grown in size and complexity and are increasingly embedded in corporate, transnational, and international networks, such as, for example, Britain and the European Union, distances citizens and their expressed preferences from the laws, policies, actors, and decisions that actually govern them. Indeed, democratic governments may be caught in a paradox. In order to successfully address problems such as climate change, they must make robust commitments to multilateral cooperation, long-term planning, and increased reliance on expert knowledge. Yet in doing so, they move away from the direct authorizations of their citizens. Either through incompetence or treachery, democratic governments, in the eyes of many people, increasingly are seen as having stabbed us in the back. And into this breach step authoritarians, increasingly deploying this very language. So then to move to some concluding remarks, what I've tried to do in this talk is to identify some misunderstood risks of climate change. And I focused on two that I think are especially neglected: existential risks and political risks. Political risks matter because the very future of liberal societies and democratic governance are in jeopardy. Existential risks matter because they feed political risks and because they also threaten the very sources of meaning in our lives. Together, existential and political risks contribute to and reflect our sense of powerlessness. We cause climate change collectively, yet as individuals, we experience it as an external threat, undermining the physical and psychological conditions of our lives. The more that climate change penetrates our consciousness, the more central these neglected risks will become, and the more insecurity and anger they will engender. Yet, we must go on. The old environmentalism of Henry David Thoreau, John Muir, Rachel Carson, and Aldo Leopold saw environmentalism as a way of life rather than as a set of solutions. And something of this spirit remains alive in people who do small things, such as turning off lights, recycling, composting, biking, and eating plant-based diets, even when the experts tell them that their individual actions are ineffectual. But seeing ourselves simply as instruments for producing a more sustainable world is itself antithetical to the spirit of environmentalism. It matters who we are and how we live, not just what we bring about. This sense of agency is central to the tradition of environmentalism. Nature teaches many lessons. Some are about joy and wonder, while others are about indifference and suffering. It is the ultimate destiny of living things to disappear into nature's maw. For thinking beings, this is a tragic fate. But it also gives them the opportunity for meaning. We will certainly die, but it matters to us how we die, when we die, and whether our living has mattered to others. In a letter to a friend written near the end of his life, Aldo Leopold wrote that the situation is hopeless. should not prevent us from doing our best. This sentiment, expressed by one of environmentalism's founders, would be deplored by many of today's experts as an unempowering counsel of despair. But for Leopold, it was the opposite. The truth really can set you free and provide a new beginning. Thank you very much for your attention in these difficult times.
Thanks so much, Dale. So much to talk about there. You talked about, mentioned COP21, Paris, the UN Climate Change Conference of the Parties. And of course, when we scheduled this talk, we hoped it would be coinciding more or less with COP26 in Glasgow. And that the very fact that that conference has been postponed because of COVID, I think raises questions about the urgency with which we are treating these matters or not. But then there's so much I'd like to discuss, but I'm going to leave it to others to ask the questions. I mean, this question you mentioned at the end about environmentalism as a way of life rather than as a set of solutions, that's such a suggestive topic. We get to spend an hour talking about that alone. If you would like to ask questions, if you're watching the live stream of this, which you could be doing either on Zoom or the YouTube channels of the RSE or the RIP, in all those platforms there are sections where you can tap in your questions and they're going to be looked at, and they'll all come to me by a human being and not an algorithm, and we'll hopefully discuss as many as we can. But before that, to really get our conversation going, we've now going to have a response to the talk, a short response to the talk by Talia Shoval. Talia is a PhD candidate in political theory at the University of Edinburgh. Her research project is focused on the interplay between environmental ethics and the ethics of war. She's very interested in the ethical relationships between human beings and the non-human environment. She's also the senior editor of Strife, a postgraduate peer-reviewed journal in the Department of War Studies at King's College London. So we're going to get some response to the talk from Talia, and then we'll have a bit of discussion between Talia and Dale, and we'll be bringing in your questions throughout. So over to Talia.
I would first of all like to thank Professor Jamieson for a truly fascinating and thought-provoking talk on a topic that I think is one of the most important ones today, and one that arguably should take a higher space on the priority ladder and political agenda worldwide. I would like to thank the Royal Institute of Philosophy and the Royal Society of Edinburgh for inviting me to be a respondent in this event. I am honored and delighted to take part. So for this response, I am going to zoom in on 4 themes or issues that were raised in the talk, and which I find incredibly insightful and intriguing, and offer a set of comments and questions that hopefully may enable us to progress in discussion. The first set of questions is about the origins of our misunderstanding of climate change risk. The second set of questions focuses on the connection between desperation and hope in the context of climate action. The third set of questions relates to the crisis of representative democracy in a climate-changed world. And the final set of questions will address the issue of agency. So first, regarding the sources of misunderstanding. So I find the understanding of misunderstanding in Professor Jamieson's account very useful and illuminating, since it does seem to be the case that in the age of almost infinite information, it is plausible that rather than simply not knowing the relevant truth about climate change, the problem lies in failing to recognize the importance and weight that these truths carry. I do wonder, in this respect, what is the moral notion that is implied here, and what does that say about our responsibility for recognizing perhaps these morally weighty risks? So I thought it was absolutely brilliant to draw this line between this particular mode of misunderstanding to the explanation of what precisely it is that is being misunderstood, namely the political and existential risks of climate change, as Professor Jamieson compellingly puts it. I do wonder whether this misunderstanding can be said to be stemming from a fundamentally misguided view of our place vis-a-vis nature. So in this respect, I am wondering what would be the response to concerns coming from non-anthropocentrism. So what I have in mind here are critical environmental accounts who challenge our very own mode of being and thinking in the modern or postmodern era, namely our culture, our economy, and ultimately our morality. So I'm curious to hear more about Professor Jamieson's position here regarding the claim that perhaps what is needed to resolve the climate crisis is a complete shift of paradigm with regards to our interactions with the Earth. So I wonder, might this be one of the lessons that Professor Jamieson refers to when he speaks of the lesson that nature teaches us? Perhaps this lesson of humility drawn from the realization that we are just another species among many other species, and that our time here is limited and will come to an end at some point. So this was the first set of questions. And for the second set of questions, I want to talk a little bit about the link between despair and hope. So Professor Jamieson interestingly mentions these authors who have been accused of scaring the public into political and environmental apathy. I wonder, however, if this desperation could actually stimulate hope and thus a more perhaps proactive approach to environmentalism. And I guess what I have in mind here ties to the question of what is the nature of the necessary change. I could imagine someone saying that for a radical social, political, and environmental change to take place, desperation is important for generating a motivation for action. Or rather, perhaps what we need is not a radical change, but reform in the current state of affairs. So my question is, could this desperation from the climate situation be actually an important element in cultivating hope, perhaps in a way that contributes to producing meaning in the Anthropocene, thereby perhaps motivating climate action? And if so, should this action be a move towards radical change or reform? So regardless, I was completely fascinated by the argument that it is not merely our physical extinction that worries us, but actually our cultural and perhaps spiritual extinction. So as Professor Jamieson interestingly notes, the loss of human culture, ways of life, and ultimately of meaning. So it seems to me very true that even the most optimistic, forward-looking view cannot possibly compensate for the grief over our lives and the pain and suffering that this involves. So this might be somewhat controversial to ask, but I wonder, might it be that this pain, suffering, and grief over the loss of our familiar ways of living is a necessary step towards profound change, one which might create this more environmentally sustainable world, so to speak? Now, of course, even if this is true, I guess one might ask, are we willing to pay this high price of change? So I guess I'm interested to know how suffering might tie to creating an alternative meaning to human life. And is this process of meaning production about finding meaning in pain and suffering rather than try to find ways to avoid it? So the third point with respect to representative democracy, so I find it again very illuminating and interesting, this tie between the existential risk and the political threat. So it was very interesting to think about how this crisis of meaning not only mirrors but also contributes to the crisis of liberal democracy. And in light of all the failures and tensions inherent to democracy that Professor Jamieson mentions, for instance, the priority of voters over experts, perhaps in a situation that requires professional expertise more than ever. So again, this might sound a bit controversial to ask, but I do wonder, is it sensible to say that democracy is not only threatened by climate change, but perhaps by itself it poses some kind of risk to the Earth climate and the planetary system? Now, of course, I do not wish to go against democracy or liberal values, which of course I think are very important. But I do wonder if by amplifying and magnifying the already existing problems in liberal democracies, perhaps climate change could be useful for us in understanding what are the changes that are necessary with regards to the way that our democracies operate and perhaps even its core values. So I'd be very interested to know more about this. And finally, I find it incredibly interesting to frame climate change as this sort of intersectional problem, if I may put it this way, where the climate crisis leads not only to climate chaos, but also to an existential crisis of meaning and a political crisis of democratic erosion. So I was highly intrigued by the claim that we should be wary of making ourselves a kind of mere instrument for promoting environmental sustainability. And instead, if I understood this well, what we ought to do is to learn how to live well under the current circumstances. So I guess for the final point here, I am curious to hear more about this environmentalist way of life, so to speak, and how it is different from the problem-solving approach to environmentalism. So for those of us who are eager to lead such a life, I'd be happy to know more about the best ways to do so, perhaps. So I guess the question here is also, how do we strike this balance between creating meaning on the individual level and addressing the problem at hand on the more, I guess, structural level, namely the failure of our democracies to address climate change. So thank you very much again for this wonderful talk, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Talia. We've already got a lot of good questions coming in. If you could try to frame your questions so you can get them in just one comment section, about 200 characters, that's helpful for us. But otherwise, just do what you can. So we're going to have a bit of discussion now with myself and Talia and Dale. And Talia's given us so many starting off points, Dale. Normally in this kind of situation, I would give you an open invitation to respond to anything in there. But I think there's so much, we've got to break it down from the beginning. So let's go back to the first sort of cluster of questions that Talia talked about. Do pick up on things, even if they're not specifically the ones I mention in reminding us. But the first cluster of thoughts are really about our place in nature, and whether the idea of the misunderstanding is rooted in something quite fundamental. We misunderstand our place in nature. Do you have anything to say in response to that?
I don't really have much to say to that. First of all, I would like to thank Talia for just capacious, generous, and altogether wonderful comments. With respect to the first point, all I can really do is give a kind of confession of temperament. I'm someone who thinks that big ideas are not going to save us, either politically or environmentally or any other way. In fact, I guess in that sense, I'm a bit of an old Hegelian, that philosophy allows us to look back once the owl of Minerva has landed and see that there's been some dramatic change in our outlooks and our cultural ideals. But I don't really see that as a way forward. I have things to say about the way forward, but generally they're not about adopting a new paradigm, a new environmental ethic, or a radically new worldview.
Talia, can I come back to you on that? I mean, perhaps you do think there's more to be said for that. I mean, what are your own thoughts about this? Do you think that a misunderstanding of our place in nature is a significant factor in this, even if perhaps it's not something to foreground in trying to seek the solutions, as Dale suggests? I mean, in trying to understand it philosophically, what do you think the interest is there?
Yeah, so, well, I guess what I'm wondering here is, well, maybe perhaps ideas do matter in the sense that in order to understand what are the policies that should take place and that we should enact, we should know what are the goals. And in order to understand the goals, perhaps we should have a better understanding of what bears moral value, what morally matters, in other words. So it is an interesting thought, and I guess I'm recently very interested in these accounts which talk about the intrinsic value of nature in non-human animals and abiotic nature. And I guess I'm just wondering if this might have some policy implications, even though it is, we begin from this ideal or moral level, perhaps it can be translated somehow to policies. So that's the general idea that I had in mind when I formulated this set of questions.
I mean, it's an interesting point. I can come back to you, Dale, on this, because you were talking about one of the risks being existential in the sense not to our survival, but to culture and values. And what would you say to the potential objection that is once again very anthropocentric? It's actually placing a lot of value on essentially the things that we as humans value, and maybe actually it's not such a bad thing if some of those things go. There was a comment from the audience actually, which I've now got quite a lot in front of me, so I might be able to find it. But to the effect that given that our species has been so destructive, and yes, this is from someone who goes under the name of Digital Gnosis. If humans are the primates who destroy the planet and enslave each other to capitalist consumption, then why ought we survive and not burn ourselves off the planet? That's the extreme version of it, right? But yeah, I mean, maybe if we were less anthropocentric, we would be a bit more sanguine about the the loss of these things that you seem to think are bad to lose.
Right. Well, let me respond to the anthropocentrism charge, and then let me put one different kind of big idea on the table that I think does make a difference. So, first of all, we need to distinguish two forms of anthropocentrism. One kind of anthropocentrism is about the source of our values. The second kind is about the content of our values. Now, the first kind of anthropocentrism, I think, is inescapable, that our values are our values, and we go out and we imbue the world with value, and that's what it is. There is no point of view of the universe, at least not one that's accessible to us. When it comes to the content of our values, it is terribly important whether we value nature for itself, whether we value other animals for themselves, and for that matter, whether we value other people for themselves. But I would submit that we already do have a value system that does actually invest these other kinds of entities with intrinsic value. But that doesn't really get us very far. So, for example, most of us would say that we're committed to some system of human rights, that we believe that all humans have dignity, all humans are the bearers of rights, and so on. But yet that alone doesn't really prevent us from incinerating each other and killing each other, essentially on an industrial scale. So I think something more is required than just these sort of revisions in our ethical systems and value systems. Now, very quickly, one big idea here that I think really is important is that people talk about climate change as a problem to be solved. Climate change is not a problem to be solved. Anthropogenic climate change is a condition of life on Earth, one that we've brought about, but one that will dominate what it is to be human on this planet for centuries or millennia in the future. Climate change does generate problems, for example, disasters caused by extreme climatic events and so on. And we do need to be thinking about solutions to those problems generated by climate change. But the deeper challenge is to manage ourselves and our lives and our way of being in this new world that we have brought about.
Okay, there's one, you raise a point there which has again come up from an anonymous attendee from on the Royal Society of Edinburgh's stream. He says, who is the we in your talk? Much of the hopelessness is that of well-off people comfortable in a commercial society. Maybe other cultures can adapt more meaningfully and easily. Forgive anonymous attendee if I get you wrong here, but I think what's perhaps being suggested here is that we're often being told that actually the greatest threats of climate change are precisely to the poorer countries, perhaps, and not the developed ones. The developed ones are being more sheltered. Perhaps a suggestion here is that, given that, as you say, it is going to become a condition of life, that it's more threatening to those advanced societies which have come to take certain things for granted than perhaps some other societies where, again, we're not so attached to a certain unsustainable quality of life, if you like. Is there anything to that, do you think?
Right. So there's 2 points to pick up on here. I mean, first, generally in response to Anonymous's comment, I think the way to look at this is we're essentially not just doing an experiment on the planet by injecting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, but we're also performing an experiment on human society about what happens when we do that. And there's reasons to think that so-called advanced societies are more vulnerable than other kinds of societies, precisely because they're more tightly wound, they're more technologically dependent. And this kind of complexity creates certain points of vulnerability. For example, imagine that electromagnetic pulse should now go through the system of the internet, and we would all be plunged into a lack of communication, our bank accounts would be frozen, et cetera, and on it goes. That's an example where it looks like highly technological societies are going to be more vulnerable to these kinds of shocks. But yet it remains to be seen, because at least for many of life's challenges, capital does allow people to respond to them more successfully than a lack of capital. So we'll see.
Okay, thanks so much. Let me move on to the second cluster of questions that Talia had around the idea that desperation is perhaps not such a bad thing. We need a certain level of desperation to motivate action, and that in its turn can bring hope. You know, desperation, action, hope. There's a kind of sequence there. Do you see any positive role for desperation in this, perhaps?
Well, I do. I'm quite sympathetic to Talia's point in this regard. I just find that my fellow Americans need movies with happy endings, and they need to go to workshops that they find empowering. So I think there may be some real cultural differences here about the psychology of both individual and collective change.
But going back to Talia on this, I did think, I could be wrong about this, but in a few of your comments, I kind of detected a sort of recurrent theme, which perhaps, I don't know, maybe there is a cultural element to this, that on a few occasions it seems that you were taking what are clearly threats and, you know, doing the classic thing of trying to see them potentially as opportunities. And also perhaps this idea that, you know, it's like in addiction, people have to reach rock bottom before they can recover, that there's something about extreme crisis that can really push us forward. I mean, am I right to think that that's a kind of a recurrent idea in your thinking on these issues? And if so, could you perhaps say a bit more about it?
Yes, I guess it is. Well, I keep having this thought when I look at the world and the contemporary occurrences in politics and social change, and it makes me wonder: do we need, because of our human psychology and the features that are unique to our human psyche, perhaps we need beyond some threshold of suffering and pain, we can then act. Maybe we need, first of all, as I said in the comments, to have enough suffering in order for us to understand that, okay, we need to do something about this. And I guess it also ties to the question of, again, our moral psychology, and is there a way to transcend it? Should we act not in accordance to our nature in the sense of moral psychology, or maybe in opposite to the tendencies that are natural to us? So that's kind of the idea that I had in mind regarding this.
Yeah, okay, thanks. Because I think another sort of aspect to that goes this third theme about the problems with representative democracy, that in fact it's true. What we're seeing now is that representative democracy does not seem to be doing very well at coping with these challenges. But the reasons it's not doing very well, they're not new reasons, right? I mean, it's not like representative democracy was doing absolutely brilliantly, fantastically well, and then along came climate change, and it was like such a singular thing that it broke a system which otherwise worked perfectly. It's allowing us to see what's wrong with it and help to improve it. I mean, Dale, if you do agree with that at all, if you disagree, please just disagree. If you do agree, because I think you articulated very well what a lot of the problems are, how do we then respond to this in ways that don't just simply mean giving up on this and going to dictatorship or something like that?
Right, so, no... Well, again, I think there's 2 points to make here at the outset. One is that what we call democracies in the United States and the UK are fairly pale imitations of what any reasonable democratic theorist, I think, should think of as democracies. So, you know, there's this old saw that was attributed to Gandhi, which is probably highly apocryphal, in which he was supposedly once asked what he thought of Western civilization, and he supposedly said it sounded like a good idea and somebody should try it. And I do think that there's a way in which we should try to improve our democracies and then see before we actually get too desperate about change. So that's one point. Secondly, I think it's important to recognize, as you mentioned, Julian, that these are old debates. And in the United States, for example, this was a debate that really went on between John Dewey and Walter Lippmann in the 1920s around the role of expertise in democracy. And Lippmann argued that the challenges of modern life were so complex and technologically demanding that even within a broadly democratic system, we needed to find reservoirs of expertise that were insulated and effective in trying to address these problems. Essentially, Dewey accepted Lippmann's reading of the challenges, but said, no, what this was an argument for is really something like the creation of a new democratic person, and that then began to move into his theories of progressive education and so on. So I think in many ways, we're part of an ongoing dialogue that for too long has really been on the margins of both philosophy and society in general.
Can I just come back on one thing you were saying there? Because your first point was about how actually our societies aren't democracies in any pure sense. And I suppose the implication of that was that we should try being more democratic. The counter-argument is actually they've only worked as well as they have done because they're not democracies in the true sense that the kind of democracy which is purer, the will of the people and everything, that exactly is what leads to the populism of unnamed leaders around the world now, and the kind of things that Plato and Aristotle thought would be the awful implications of democracy. So it seems like there might also be a case that we shouldn't make the mistake of going to too much of that kind of direct democracy. So how would you see? I mean, I might be asking you for something which is too specific in the context of this talk, but are there any ways in which you think we can make democracy better in the right ways without leading to that kind of rule of the majoritarianism and tyranny of the majority?
So there's an empirical question here, and then there's a normative question that goes back to a point that Talia raised. I mean, the empirical question is really, would we be worse off than we already are with something that looked more like a real democracy? And I don't know the answer to that. I do know that a lot of the surveys in the United States, for example, indicate that people are much more concerned about climate change than is registered in our political system. But again, that's an open question. The point that Talia raised that I think is really important here was, right at the outset, was a question about academic responsibility. So when I talked, for example, about problems being misunderstood, while, so to speak, we have knowledge of the relevant information, it raises the question, who's responsible for knowing what, who's responsible for obscuring what? And so, for example, in the United States, and in Britain for that matter, we're very committed to freedom of speech, but we don't really distinguish the expression of opinion from an individual from gaslighting, overt manipulation, misleading, and lying on the part of corporate entities who are serving to seek their own profits and to maximize their interests. And maybe we need to do that. I mean, maybe a real democracy would be a better functioning democracy if, in fact, it adopted some structures that we think are in some ways in tension with liberalism. Liberalism and democracy are really not the same concepts.
Talia, since you raised the question, I imagine you might have some thoughts on how we might respond to these challenges. So to put you on the spot, do you have any positive suggestions for us?
I don't know if I have a solution or a complete argument about this, but yes, it is interesting to think about this tension between expertise and the right of the demos to decide for themselves. I guess I really don't have an answer, but yes, it does seem to me that we need to find somehow a way to incorporate professional expertise, scientific expertise in a way that will affect policy making, not over the expense of the voter, but yes, it should have more weight. That's my answers for now, my thoughts about this.
Sure, no, it's putting you on the spot here in the live format, but that's great. And the final sort of set of thoughts that Talia brought up was really, in a sense, an invitation to hear more about this distinction you make between environmentalism as a way of life and environmentalism as a problem-solving project. I won't ask anything more specific to begin with. I'll just invite you just to expand as you will, and then I may have some more specific questions about that.
All right, so let's make a very sharp contrast between the challenge of being sustainable on the one hand, and on the other hand, a kind of ineffectual life in accordance with the green virtues. Now, we can imagine a sustainable society being a highly technocratic society, a society which doesn't recognize much by way of human autonomy, human dignity, individual human meaning, and so on, but yet a society that works very well in terms of the species Homo sapiens living within its resources on the planet. This is not the vision of at least the traditional American environmentalism that I was referring to. On the other hand, we have this image of sort of self-indulgent, spoiled, upper middle class people being very concerned about whether this or that is organic and so on, and generally living lives that are quite apolitical and quite cut off from being able to make meaningful change. I think the kind of environmental vision which inspired the environmental movement, say someone like Rachel Carson, someone like Aldo Leopold, is a vision in which we view ourselves as agents, not just as levers to bring about the creation of the sustainability machine, but actually as agents who can make some difference in the world. Now, the challenge that we face in what's come to be called the Anthropocene, the climate change world, is that our agency feels ablated. We collectively are causing these problems, but as individuals, our individual action doesn't bear very directly on these problems. So what we need to do is to go back to the core. What is it in life that I can make a difference about? And it turns out that it's quite a lot. Every time I decide what to have for lunch, I'm making some small difference in the world, and I'm also making a difference in my own life in the sense that I can make choices that actually conform to my expressed values. So I think we need to go back to this really fundamental core sense of agency that one can have over one's own life, and then build out from that to the whole, to create the possibility of really meaningful collective change.
If I can put up a question actually from Henry Roberts coming through the Royal Society of Edinburgh. It comes in two parts actually, so we'll have both parts. The first part, which is not up, says, when we talk about things like human relationship with the earth and debating how much we are willing to change our lifestyle, do we not have a responsibility to acknowledge climate justice, the unequal emissions burdens felt by people in the global south? And I think the reason I brought that up now was there is a kind of feeling, I think, that a lot of people have that when we emphasize, as it were, changing our way of life, changing the way we adapt to nature, and seeing that as primary over the solutions, as it were, I think you've alluded to this, Dale, in a way. There's a risk of that turning into a kind of indulgence that, you know, we can get better in touch with nature, but while the world goes to hell and perhaps people at the harsh end of it are left to pick up the pieces. I think, presumably, well, I could be wrong. Is part of the answer that it's not either or. it's not focusing on that at the expense of the consequences. Is it about emphasis, or is it? Sorry, I've just thrown up some thoughts.
Yeah, the rejection of binaries is always, of course, a good first step. Yes. But broadly on the subject of climate justice, again, I think we need to look at some context here. Every time there is dramatic change in the world, it does create an opportunity for building new institutions, and in particular to build new institutions that are increasingly just. Unfortunately, we almost never take advantage of change in order to build new just institutions. I was very much affected years ago when I did a study of the impacts of Hurricane Mitch on Honduras, the 1998 hurricane that wiped out about 30% of the infrastructure in Honduras. We were interviewing people there. And I remember someone, a political activist from the left, telling me that we used to believe in the revolution, but now we believe in the hurricane, because the hurricane had upended Honduran society, and now there was the opportunity to build it back in a way that was more just. This almost never happens. It didn't happen in Honduras then. What happens, rather, is that extreme events only exacerbate existing inequalities. And of course, this is exactly what we've seen in the case of COVID. So when it comes to managing the problem of climate change, I think if we make justice a gate through which successful management has to enter, that's just a recipe for failing to manage the problem. Sadly, tragically, but I'm afraid that's true.
One perhaps final point on this question of environmentalism as a way of life, or rather a set of solutions. You may think this is, I don't know what you'll make of this, but one thing I was thinking of hearing you talk about that was, I've been recently quite interested actually in, as a non-Christian, in what Jesus was teaching as ethically. And one of the things that he seemed to be most interested in was this idea of, although he talks about the poor and the weak, actually it seemed to me his primary concern with is what the theologians call metanoia. It's the transformation of the self, the work on the soul. And this is actually the most important thing. And I'm not saying that's exactly what you were saying, but let's put it this way. There are different traditions in moral thought in different cultures at different times. The dominant ones in our world seem to be sort of broadly utilitarian, doing the right things to bring about the right responses. There's another whole tradition of ethics, which is about change of soul, change of self, work on the self. And is what you're saying at least a call to kind of change that balance, to remind ourselves that ethics isn't just about these utilitarian calculations?
Well, yes, it is. And in fact, I think it's a perfectly good utilitarian idea if one is actually thinking of the utilitarianism of somebody like John Stuart Mill, for example, rather than the sort of cardboard cutout utilitarianism of its opponents, increasingly embraced by people who call themselves utilitarians. I would rather describe it as a return to the Greek idea that the fundamental question of ethics is really how to live, where how to live involves both this internal regulation and transformation and also our relationship and connection to the world around us. One of the things I think that's gone badly wrong is that particularly in wealthy societies in the West, somehow we have this idea that the world should really conform itself to my desires. I should be able to stop wars and end hunger and have actually a hot double cappuccino delivered to me on command anytime I want. So our sense of what our agency should dominate is egregiously huge. And then, of course, we become frustrated and depressed when the world doesn't conform to our every desire. We need, I think, to have a more modest sense of what our purview in the world should be. And then in finding our ability, which begins with this ability to change ourselves, and once we see that that's possible and important and rewarding, then from those materials we can build up, I think, a meaningful sense of agency.
Thanks very much. One of the disadvantages of doing this digitally was that if we were together, I could sort of make a little quiet sort of gesture to Talia to see if she's got anything to come in and say at this point. And if she didn't, I could just move on. I have to actually ask you directly. Anything in what Dale said, any of those responses that you'd like to perhaps pick up on and take further?
Yeah, so I think I have one question about this. So it does seem to me very important to develop some kind of environmental character, perhaps. But I am wondering, what could one do if the structure of reality, for example, the economic system, won't let me be an environmentalist? For example, if I want to switch my diet and become a vegetarian, but when I go to the supermarket, all the vegetables are nylon. So I contribute to the plastic pollution in the sense.
Right, and those are the challenges that many people face these days. And it's another thing that I think is neglected in contemporary ethics is what we might call the problem of moral perception or the problem of moral salience. So when I find myself facing an insurmountable moral challenge, the question that arises really is, where is the lever? Where can change really be made here? And it may be the case that it can't be made in the supermarket. It has to be made, in this case, at a political level or at the level of boycotting a corporation or something like that. All of these things can be sort of meaningful points of agency that aren't necessarily just to be located in one place, namely, in this case, the consumer place.
It's an interesting point there, Dale, because I mean I'm quite involved with a thing called the Food Ethics Council, and which has also worked with the new citizenship project. And one of the things they're very keen on, both organisations are keen on, is the way in which actually so much of how things are framed now is around how we act as consumers. And they're rather, sceptical of the idea that, through our own individual choices, we can save the planet, because that kind of feeds into this idea that we're primarily consumers and not citizens. And there's an importance of collective action as citizens, and not just with things we can buy, which is very important for bringing around change. And I please feel free to say something more about that if you like, but I imagine that's something you'd be sympathetic to. We do have some other questions coming in now from our audience. There's one I'm not going to put it up on the screen because it's spread over 2 or 3 pieces and it's going to be a bit bitty, but it's inspired actually by Gramsci. But the idea here is about social media. Social media always has to come up in these debates about how well our democracy is functioning. And is there just a concern that the social media world is not conducive to the kind of settled, slow thought which is required for people to make, proper choices in a democratic society? I suppose the question, in a way, is whether or not the very form of social media is undermining the conditions that are necessary for a thriving democracy. I'm aware that social media wasn't the subject of the talk directly, but it does relate. Do either of you have anything to say in response to that, or both? Dale? You're sure nodding your head anyway.
Sorry, well, I was also looking at Talia, but the first thing to say is yes, but the thing to say is I think even the problem of social media goes back to this erosion of agency, because I think again was perhaps more strongly in the United States than in many others, but as real agency has eroded, fake agency has grown to replace it. And so calling out people on social agency, and by spilling and by making threats and by saying absurd things, people have this completely phony of empowerment. And I think something like that also connects to the sort of American fascination with guns, for example. People buy and carry guns because it makes them feel empowered, though actually they can't legally use them. So I actually think one way of trying to tame social agency is by trying to create a more robust sense of agency, but of course, more robust sense of agency also involves figuring out what the place of social media is in the society.
Okay, and Talia, I mean, your generation is often blamed for this in social media. It's not your fault, actually. It was around when you came about. But do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, this is a tricky question, I guess, because there are 2 sides. Of course, we all know that social media can generate amazing changes and do the opposite. I do think that these days, perhaps my generation, even more the younger generation, Generation Z, I think social media is an important tool, perhaps to cultivate or develop this environmental consciousness. And I think that this is just my view from what I can see. I think that the environmental discourse is more, I guess, prominent in social media than in mainstream media and television, like the mainstream news channels. So yes, I do think that there is, this could be a very avenue of creating change. And yes, I think that the question of mass media in general ties back to the problem of democracy, and I personally would love to see mainstream media being more, I guess, proactive when it comes to creating this environmental consciousness and raising environmental awareness among the public. So
perhaps I could just add to it. Could I just add something to what Talia says? I mean, I think I think we need to reframe this social media, because this is going to sound horribly anachronistic and old and terrible, but there's a sense in which social media has always existed. A letter that someone sends back to their family in their home country, which is then read by everyone in the family, is a form of social media. Gossip is a form of social media. We've had traditionally extremely effective forms of social media. What we have now is a kind of instantaneous technological social media that is actually owned and controlled by profit-making multinational corporations. And that is the challenge, both the rapidity and speed, and as Julian was suggesting, the sort of lack of reflection that goes into some social media communications, which has always been a problem. And secondly, the way that that's mediated by capitalist institutions that actually, in America, are themselves persons from a legal point of view.
Yeah, I mean, demonizing social media is, of course, pointless. I mean, one of the ways in which we direct people's attention to an event like this is by using social media. So a very quick, snappy little tweet or something can actually lead someone to something much more thought through and slow. A couple more things from our audience. So we have one from another anonymous attendee. As cultures decline during environmental change, other cultures arise. Anything in particular, governance or cultural movements arising, hopefully, for you? So this is just sort of, I think we're trying to sort of move towards hopeful later thoughts here. Do you actually, have you, I mean, forget, what we might want or what we might anticipate. Is there anything you're already seeing that's changing around social movements as a result of the crisis, which gives you cause for hope? We'll see both of you. Dale first.
Well, I have a feeling Talia might be more optimistic than me about this. I mean, I think there's two things to say. The first is that if there is such a thing as creative destruction, I think we're more in the phase of destruction before creation at this point. We're still at a moment when we're losing a lot of the old, and it's hard to get a glimpse of the new. The other point, though, is one that was in my talk, which had to do with the incredible rebound from that Europe underwent from a devastated continent in World War II to many people enjoying better lives than ever in just 2 or 3 decades. That is a remarkable achievement. It shows that there is an amazing resilience in humanity and its cultures. But of course, my point was that in no way compensates for or nullifies the real loss and destruction that occurred. And I think that's what we're going to see. We're going to see people are going to fall in love, wonderful artworks will be made, brilliant cultural manifestations will occur, maybe even a juster and more equal society will exist in 2100, but it will be a society that in many ways stands in a relationship of rupture to much of what we know and value today.
Talia, do you see any hopeful signs of movements already arising in response to this?
Well, I can't say that I am personally encouraged by movements such as Greta Thunberg that Professor Jamieson mentioned in this talk. So on the one hand, yes, these youth movements and the radical movements such as Extinction Rebellion give me some kind of hope. But I'm, again, quite pessimistic in regards to the future, and I can't really make a prediction, obviously, and predict the future, but it does seem to me that it will probably get worse before it gets better. But on the other hand, I do see some changes in even the people around me and the general discourse in the media, even in politics. So I think that things are changing and moving to the right direction. And the question is it enough? Are we doing it? Is it enough? And I'm not sure that I'm optimistic about this question, unfortunately.
Okay, we got go Dale. So I come back.
Well, Julian, I just wanted to add again to bring in the political again, because in many ways I am more confident that things that we value will be recreated a half century or a century or 2 centuries out, than I am that political institutions that allow diversity as a way of life and participation in self-governance, that they will survive. So I would say in many ways, I am at least as worried about the vulnerability of liberal democratic ideals to the changes that are underway as I am about the actual physical ecological changes.
Now, I've got two questions I want to put one after the other. They may seem to go back to the idea of seeing environmentalism as a problem-solving activity rather than a way of life, but I want to kind of perhaps make the connection, given that we've already said that false binaries should be avoided. So the first is from Norman Alm via the Royal Society of Edinburgh. He says, given the political unacceptability of halting or reversing economic development is not the only hope, a technological one. That's Norman's suggestion. Leslie Martin, on the other hand, asks whether the theory of degrowth, does a theory of degrowth offer any kind of solution? And, so we have sort of different ways of thinking, how do we solve the problem from a practical point of view? Is it about kind of, almost sort of like doubling down on technology and development, or is it about a complete different path? And I guess that even if we accept what you say, Dale, about how we shouldn't see this so much as about the solution, it's about a way of life. Given that we do have to do something practical, do you think either of these paths, or perhaps if not a third one, is the one that we should adopt? Because irrespective of, it's not just a question of how effective we think it's going to be in managing climate change. Which one gives us the better hope of, the kind of way of life that you think we should be embracing?
Well, so this, I think, goes back to something Talia was suggesting about social media, about the way that we should think about technologies is that they provide, they create new opportunities, and they also impose new costs. The invention of the automobile, the internal combustion engine, was a remarkable thing in terms of allowing people to go to places they'd never been before and have connections with people they'd never had before. And it also got rid of all of that terrible pollution in city streets that was caused by horses. But one of the unanticipated, and that's not a joke, that was a real health risk that automobiles were able to solve. But the creation of the automobile, in turn, created its own set of risks from air pollution, from climate change, and so on. I think the first thing is that all technological change will be like that. Technological change will help deliver us from some of the challenges we face at present, but will create new ones for the future. That just is human life on this earth, trying to manage ourselves on a rapidly changing planet that increasingly is a planet whose changes are being brought about by human action. The second thing to recognize is that technologies have politics. And again, this goes back to, I think, something I said earlier about social media, which is social media is one thing, social media owned by some people to line their own pockets, who are very important and powerful political actors, is another thing. And so I think especially people in the scientific community and academic community tend to think too much about technology development and not enough about who owns technologies, who benefits technology from technological development, and what the politics of those technologies are.
Okay, I'm going to ask you both just to offer any final reflections. And just to do that, I'll throw multiple stimuli at you, but also feel free just to say anything else that's left burning. I should point out that a couple of the questions and comments we've had have been around broader issues of justice and the connection between justice, global justice, and the environmental issue, and also, Talia used the word intersectionality earlier, whether there's any connection here with what's going on with the Black Lives Matter movement, which is something, a whole other area to explore. And the final one, just to put up perhaps from Grace Garland, is it possible to have too much hope or too little? What is just the right amount of hope to have in a cataclysmic present and future? So there's just a few things I'd throw out for you, but this is your just last opportunity to talk about whatever it is you would like to talk about. So perhaps a few minutes for Talia first, and then we'll end with Dale.
So I think in relation to hope, so that's an interesting question. I think maybe an answer to this might be It is not a matter of quantity, but more of quality. So perhaps the hope that we should cultivate is some kind of pragmatic hope. So yes, we shouldn't be too hopeful because that might actually lead to apathy in some kind of paradoxical way, because we will have this false or misguided feeling that everything is going in the right direction and therefore we don't need to do anything. Yes, I think there is such a thing as too much hope, but the emphasis should be on the quality of the hope and what it leads to. Regarding intersectionality, yes, so this is of course an interesting question, and well, I think because ecological damage and climate change is fundamentally a global issue, obviously, and it affects all dwellers of the earth, every creature and also not creatures that exist upon the earth. And therefore, I think that inevitably ties also to questions of social justice, racial justice, and yeah, so I think it is also a very important issue to take into consideration in policy making regarding climate change. And I think I just want to say that I completely agree with Professor Jamieson about the about technology and the ways in which, for example, social media. Yes, it could have very good implication on the one hand, giving voice to people to express their opinions and raise awareness. On the one hand, of course, it causes additional problems and benefits particular people. Let's see. So that's it.
Thank you. Dale, final thoughts.
Right. So I think the question of justice is an abiding ancient question that goes as far back as anything in our cultures and oldest writings. And I think that Talia, it was very important for Talia to remind us that questions of justice involve justice for the non-human as well as justice for the humans. This is one issue. This is a seamless issue. But the question of justice is not particular to climate change. It's not particular to any disruption. It's not only an international question. It's not only a domestic question. It's a challenge that takes different forms in different societies. In the United States, the most immediate, pressing, and profound question of justice has to do with the unacknowledged legacy of slavery in the United States. But it takes, as I say, different forms in other countries. And it's just something that isn't peculiar to climate change or any particular issue. It's something we must be promoting and working for all the time in every area of life, recognizing that change generally provides opportunities for the rich and powerful to become more rich and powerful rather than for the regress of inequalities. And on the hope point, I will just end by quoting something that was told to me by the person who actually introduced me to the issue of climate change now more than 40 years ago, and that is Mickey Glantz, who was a scientist at the National Center for Atmospheric Research. And I remember a very early conversation we had about climate change. Even then, he said we should think like a pessimist and live like an optimist. And I continue to think that is extremely good advice.
Thank you so much. A few thanks actually to be said before we just wrap up. I mean, these lectures have been going since 2014, and they were at the instigation of John Haldane, who's both the chair of the Council of the Royal Institute of Philosophy and a fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. So thank you to John, without whom this series wouldn't have existed. At the RSC, we've got to thank Nazia Khan, James Thomas and Sarah Skerret in particular for their help in making this possible. And Matt Titterton has been behind the scenes, flicking switches and much, much, much more. That's a typically dismissive way of talking about the really difficult technical work which has made this possible, thanks to him. The RSC and the RIP are both active all year round. Check out our respective websites to see what else is going on. We do use social media to let you know about things, so you can sign up to the accounts there. Also ways of signing up to newsletters. But finally, just leaves me to thank you all for watching and taking part. Thank you for all your questions and contributions. Thank you to Talia Shoval for a really stimulating start to our conversation, and of course also primarily to Dale Jamieson for what was a really interesting talk, which is going to bear reviewing, very worthwhile reviewing on YouTube for as long as YouTube exists and the apocalypse doesn't come. Thank you very much.